Please take them. I'm going to be able to get around and hand them out, but please just take one. It gives you a little more information about what Chime is all about.
So here, let me make my point somewhat provocatively. This is because we've touched briefly on sort of the religiosity of some of what we do. This is the equivalent of that pamphlet that you get handed with, good news on it.
Looks kind of like it.
Right. So this is our version of that. And the canon, I just wanted to bring up the canon briefly. One of the things that I think people criticize the Great Books education for, there's the democratic aspect of it that Hutchins pushes, but people read him suspiciously as really promoting the idea of cultural capital, which we discussed at Chime recently in the House of Teachings. The idea there is that, really what you're getting educated in is, and I'm here being intentionally provocative, but just to sort of throw this in the mix, you're getting an education in how to drop Plato's name glibly. When you're going for a job or you're at a cocktail party. So there's a way in which you're learning a vocabulary, you're learning a certain way of thinking and speaking that has a cachet still. So there's a cultural sort of there's a material aspect to the sort of the cultural goods that you're getting when you're shopping as well, and that's a little bit sort of the debate that's also currently raging around the Great Books education that we haven't quite talked about as much, but in the 90s, most of you were still, in the early 90s there was something called the Culture Wars, and a great debate during that time was just this, the canon, and who should be included, who shouldn't be included, what's it for anyway, should we have one, that sort of thing. So I think I would add that to the mix of what Barb was talking about in terms of the kinds of things, the kinds of forces that are at play. That battle doesn't rage nearly as hotly as it did 20 years ago, but it has left its mark on Great Books schools, and so Great Books reform is in some ways a response to that. So while Scheimer was making its way to Waukegan, it was also making its way through a real cultural shift following the 60s and the debates about the canon.
Any more questions? I think we have time for about 2 more maybe, so let's get one from Ben.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
This might overextend to include what you just said, Stuart, but I think it is involved. Part of what Barb was saying about the promotion of citizenship and the atmosphere of vocation being on the rise rang out to me of the recent struggle of the Chicago public schools have just been through, and that the charter system is often promoted as the exclusive language of employment, and that public education is no longer specialized enough to contribute to that. And then Barbara, you, I think, very beautifully pointed out that part of the democratization isn't just getting everyone to read for a semblance of understanding, it's promoting the citizenship of being able to share that understanding, which is a hallmark of public education. So in that response, what we just saw, I think, victoriously from the public system, were people of the community striking out their citizenship for their schools and coming around to their schools and being able to share that their neighborhood deserved that school. I wonder if the panel thought that there was a way for Scheimer to take up the quality of citizenship in a new community to sort of respond to that vocational pressure. If there is a way for our curriculum to teach citizenship in a way that can combat that prevailing view that no, you can only really learn a certain technical language and then that's what gets you into a job. So whether or not citizenship can promote vocational cachet against that, and if we can do that and grow our school in the process of doing that. It's a very overextended question. Is there a way for us to sell citizenship?
I was just going to bring up one of the other things that came up along with debates about the canon, and it's part of a much broader social change, some big social ties behind all of the sort of smaller changes that we've been using Scheimer and the Great Books education as a kind of gauge of big movements in American society. service learning. And the question as to whether places of higher education are, in what way they are of their place or secluded from it. So the college ideal, while it sounds nice from the inside, from the outside, what you're looking at is a big wall, the ivory tower kind of thing. And so there are, and those ideals are lasting. I mean, they have a great social psychological force, and I think that it's a hard thing for people to get their ideas around the fact that we should open the doors and send everybody out and do projects. I mean, in a way, there's a contradiction there that is hard to resolve unless you completely reinvent the institution. Nobody's quite prepared to do that kind of thing. So I think, I only say that not to say that it's impossible, but that it's a very, very deep question in terms of what relationship learning has to the world. That is a question, personally for all of us, sort of, the point is not to study the world, it's to change it. That's sort of the rallying cry, but institutionally that becomes very difficult. So one of the solutions to that problem is what they call service learning, where you go out and you do your volunteerism and you sort of practice citizenship, but you're learning at the same time. And so trying to meld those two aspects of the college's life together, I think, is something that we occasionally sort of puzzle ourselves over. But I think Scheimer is just beginning to think about how that works. I mean, much of what we talk about in terms of education for citizenship in Scheimer is things like the assembly, so how governance of the school. But that's still the internal sort of collegium. There are other things. I mean, there's a lot of volunteerism that goes outside the doors. But service learning, so melding citizenship and activity outside with the curriculum is something that a lot of schools are still figuring out.
Right.
I think that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is I think the virtues, the behaviors we expect of ourselves in the classroom, respect, good listening skills, practice in speech. I think those are all things that are about citizenship and being responsible citizens. And I think taking those out into the world, whether we can do it institutionally more and more, or whether all students, graduates can take that out into the world, into their workplaces, into lots of places. Most workplaces now have teams, working with teams, with groups, rather than solitary, and modeling a certain way in which teams can work together, so that it isn't the sort of the cliche experience. I had to do this project in a group, and it's the way it always is. One person does all the work, and everybody else slacks off, and then it's a bad experience. But those kinds of things, I think, is it's not a project-oriented, but it's a kind of expectation of a certain kind of social conscience and moral conscience towards one another. I think we see that, as when we talk about a good Scheinerian, that's really a large part of what we're talking about.
We can start giving the last question now, I think. Let's see what you got.
There's been a criticism that the canon is Eurocentric. Is that a valid criticism?
Sure. Can you expound? Yeah, I don't know if I can do it in 2 minutes.
Well, there are lots of canons.
Yeah, there are lots of canons. I mean, Barbara mentioned this thing in the Great Conversation, right? The Great Conversation, the first volume of the Great Books. And it's this issue of East versus West, right? Hutchinson's claim is we're not prioritizing the West over the East, right? There are great books everywhere. There are great texts to be learned. There are great things. Now, this is a perspective on greatness, right? But it's not intended to be, and he was very clear on this, Eurocentric greatness, right? His view was not, right, the West is better than the East, or the West is better than anything. Right? Now, he does say, and thank you, Stuart. No, this is right. He says, there are